So this is going to be section 2.3, and we're going to talk about conditional statements. And so these blanks here are going to be what a conditional statement is. So a conditional statement is a statement that can be written in if-then form. So below is an example of a conditional statement. So I'm going to read it to you, and then we're going to talk about it. If you would like to talk to a representative, then you will press 0 now. So if you've ever been on like a phone call and you've got to press a number, you've probably heard this if-then statement before. So focus on the if-then, and then let's come down and talk about the parts of the if-then. So if you have an if-then statement, we're going to say that there are two parts. There's going to be a hypothesis, and then there's going to be a conclusion. A hypothesis is going to be in the front, and the conclusion is going to be in the back. And we're going to use the letters P and Q to represent the hypothesis and conclusion. So if you have an if-then statement, it's going to be P implies Q, or if P, then Q. For instance, if you would like to talk to a representative is P, the arrow means then you will press 0 now would be Q. So P arrow Q means that you have an if-then statement, a conditional statement. When you go to diagram this idea of a hypothesis and conclusion, you have to read carefully because the hypothesis is the phrase that follows the word if, but you're not going to include if in it. So you're going to come up here and you're going to like bracket off this part. I'm even going to like cross out the if so you don't even underline it. Your hypothesis would be you would like to talk to a representative. That is the hypothesis, so I will label that with an H. Don't include if. The conclusion, it says, is the part of the conditional that immediately follows the word then, not including then. Okay, so let's scratch out then, and let's bracket off. You will press 0 now. That is the conclusion. It's going to sound funny when you say it, but you do not want to include if and then. So that is an original conditional statement. Okay, so we're going to skip example 1 because you're going to come back and do that by yourself in a second. And we're going to go down to this middle part of the page. It says, many conditional statements are written without using the words if and then. To write these statements in if-then form, you're going to first identify the hypothesis and conclusion, and then you're going to change it into if-then form. Okay, I'm going to give you an example. And you probably have heard this from an English teacher maybe. Points will be deducted from any paper turned in after Wednesday's deadline. Okay, so what you have to do is when you read the statement, you have to ask yourself, what is the beginning of that statement and what is the conclusion or the result? So do you guys see how the hypothesis is in the back, but the conclusion of what happens to you is in the front? So when you go to write this in if-then form, this is going to have to be your P and this is going to have to be your Q. It's in inverted order. So here's how you would write that. You would say, if a paper is turned in after Wednesday's deadline, then points will be deducted. So make sure you always look and see what's the original thing that's happening and then what's the conclusion. So this would be the original thing and then this would be the conclusion that happens because of it. All right, so now down at the bottom, we are going to skip the first part, and you'll do this later, and we'll come down and try this one. So the first thing they'd want us to do is identify the hypothesis and conclusion before we try to write it in if-then form. So let's read this. If it is time for dinner, let me reread this. It is time for dinner if it is 6 p.m. Okay, so do you guys see how there's an if already in the statement? Go ahead and circle that if. That means that this statement is in inverted order. So this is the hypothesis of what is happening first, and what happens if it is 6 p.m. is this conclusion that it will be time for dinner. So this is in inverted order because the if is already in the statement. So you got to look for that if. If it is there, it's inverted, kind of like the example we did up there. So now we're going to write this in if-then form. If it is 6 p.m., comma, then it is time for dinner. If it is 6 p.m., then it is time for dinner. Don't forget to have the if and then. I almost forgot. Those have to be in there, and make sure you get it in the correct order. Okay, so you're going to flip your page over. The second part of the lesson are conditionals that are related to the original if-then. And there are going to be 3 of them, actually 4 of them that we'll end up using that are related. So at the top it says, there are other statements that are based on a given conditional statement. These are known as related conditionals. So all of these conditionals are related to the original. So you might notice in the first one, this is the original P arrow Q. This is if P then Q. And then you have 3 more, and you are going to be in charge of knowing these 3 and what they do. Once you get them, they're pretty easy. The converse is inverting your statement. You're taking your conclusion and putting it in front and your hypothesis and putting it back. You guys see how it says Q arrow P? That means you flipped it. Okay, now we're going to look at the inverse. When you look at the inverse, you're going to see these little tildes or negations. The tildes or the negations mean that you're going to undo what you said. So if you said it is, you're going to say it isn't. If you said it isn't, you're going to say it is. And we'll look at that in a second for the inverse. And then if you look at the contrapositive takes the original, it flips it, and it negates it. So it does both. So the contrapositive is kind of like the converse and inverse put together. So it's the most dramatic one because it does the most things. Okay, so I'm going to show you these examples over to the side. So look to the right. Here's my original statement. If the measure of angle A is 35, then angle A is an acute angle. Converse. Guess what? I'm going to flip it around. If angle A is an acute angle, then the measure of angle A is 35. See how I flipped it? Okay, now go back to the original and look at the inverse. So the original says if A is 35, A is acute. You're going to say if A is not. See that not? If A is not 35, then A is not an acute angle. You are doing the inverse, which is negation, which is saying you're taking the original statement and saying it's not going to be. And then guess what the contrapositive does to the original? It flips it and negates it. So this time you're going to flip it and negate it. So it's going to say if A is not an acute angle, then A is not 35. So you're going to learn the symbols, and you're going to use the symbols, but then you're going to take the symbols and actually do this to the different statements. Okay, so down here, you're going to see that there are logically equivalent statements, and I just want to show you to the side which ones have to match. This is kind of cool, actually, when you start working with these. When you have a conditional, the contrapositive will also be true. So if your conditional is true, your contrapositive is true. That's kind of weird. And if your converse is true, your inverse is true. So it's kind of like the first and the fourth one go together. They're both true. If one's true, they're both true. And then these two go together. If one's true, they're both true also. Okay, so we're going to do an example down here. And this is going to be, we're going to write the inverse, converse, and contrapositive of the following if-then statements. Oh, let me go and let me read this to you. I want to show you this. If a conditional is true, the converse may or may not be true. So listen to this statement. If I am a linear pair, then I am supplementary. That is true. But if I flip it around and do the converse, if I am supplementary, then I'm a linear pair. That is not true. So keep in mind that just because a conditional is true, the converse might not be true, which we've been talking about. Okay, so let's practice the converse, inverse, and contrapositive of this. So if you are a lion, let's go ahead and underline you are a lion. Label that the hypothesis. Underline you can roar. That is the conclusion. Don't include if and then. All right, the converse is going to flip that around. So we're going to take the statement and flip it around. So you guys are going to write it, and I'm just going to read it to you. If you can roar, then you are a lion. So the converse would be, if you can roar, then you are a lion, because you're flipping it around. Now I'm going to go on and do the inverse and contrapositive while you're writing, and then you'll be able to skip through this if you need to. The inverse would be, if you are not a lion, then you can't roar. So I'm taking my original and I'm negating both of them. If you are not a lion, then you can't roar. And then finally, the contrapositive is going to flip and negate. So you're going to do both. So you're going to say, if you can't roar, then you aren't a lion. If you can't roar, then you aren't a lion.